A week ago, your small colonial town was alive and well. All of a sudden, your mother, brother, grandparents, pastor, and servant have died a horrible death from an unknown silent killer. Now imagine waking up to fever, chills, dizziness, and an oncoming rash all over your body. You immediately know that you are afflicted with the terrifying illness. What can be done? The record-breaking smallpox epidemic in 1721 was a tragic loss of life that rocked many families in the small colonial town of Boston and around the world. In addition, it was the worst epidemic of the century, and those who pursued the cure to this torturous disease were put down by society for their frontier ideas. On the other hand, the event was a triumph that brought light to modern medicine, increased free press and information available to the public, and sparked the vaccination regulations implemented in many institutions today. The smallpox virus, or variola in Latin, plagued the small colonial town of Boston, Massachusetts in 1721. 1721 posed as the greatest threat to the colonists, as it was the worst epidemic of the century. The disease often came and went in the 16 and 1700s, when the colonies were first being established in America. The small, fragile population of Puritans sought to get away from the corrupt British government. However, they could not escape the looming threat of smallpox. Smallpox was first spread to humans by contact with wild animals. People transferred the bacteria to others when they ejected saliva. The virus commences its journey through its human host in the saliva. When people eject their saliva close to others, they pass infection to another host. In addition, the hosts are not initially aware that they have contracted a disease because the symptoms of smallpox did not normally appear until 2 weeks after being infected. As a result, there was not many people could do to prevent the spread of smallpox because before they knew it, they were infected, and they had probably already infected several others. The smallpox virus is one of the smartest bacteria in the family of infectious diseases. It begins penetrating the saliva by posing as healthy proteins needed in the cytoplasm of the cell. Then it rapidly devours the cell's resources and multiplies inside. This causes the cell to burst, releasing thousands of copies of the virus that begin to take over other cells. As a result, skin, blood, and eventually organs will be dominated by the variola bacteria. The symptoms of smallpox begin as a flu-like virus. The host experiences fever, chills, loss of appetite, aching, nausea, and vomiting. After a few days, sores develop in the mouth, and the telltale smallpox rash begins to form all over the body. Pus fills pockets of skin, forming blisters. There are also long-term side effects, such as scarring and blindness.
The first introduction of the smallpox to Boston since 1702 was by Captain John Fore. His ship landed in Boston after a trip from London, where 7 of his men had been infected by the smallpox virus. 6 men recovered, but John Fore himself and 1 other crewmate had died. Boston was spared from the disease this time, but little did they know that another ship from London, the Seahorse, would eventually infect the Boston area. Boston had previous outbreaks in 1678, 1690, 1698, and 1702, but this epidemic in 1721 would be the most deadly to date. On April 22, 1721, the Seahorse arrived in Boston from the Caribbean islands. The crew seemed fine the first day, but the next day they were quarantined to keep the infection away once people knew that it was smallpox. By May, 9 more people in Boston had caught the disease. Despite efforts to isolate the virus until it ran out its course, the infection entered the town where people lived. When people discovered this, 1,000 fled, and out of those who did not, 5,980 were infected and 844 died. In the beginning, case fatality rate was 14.1%. Boston had 11,000 residents, 7 churches, and 11 physicians. In the past, people who had survived the outbreaks had immunity to the disease, but because the most recent outbreak was so long ago, many people with the immunity had died, and newborns clearly had no immunity either. When the epidemic hit in 1721, many people who supposedly had immunity from previous outbreaks mysteriously died. As time got farther away from 1702, the percent of smallpox immunity continued to shrink as the older generations died and new life entered the world. Even from the beginning, the colonists knew that this was the worst epidemic to hit Boston to date. More people were infected every day, and the fatality rate continued to grow month after month. Everyone wanted to know a way to limit the spread of the disease, but when new theories were introduced, they were not well accepted. This included the ideas of Cotton Mather, who came up with the procedure of inoculations. He heard of inoculations from his black slave, Wonsimus. He said that they used the technique back in Africa and it never failed to decrease the percentage of fatalities from a disease. Mather secretly inoculated a couple of people, but the colonists did not trust African medicine, so they did not approve of Mather's work. Opposition got so bad that Mather was getting death threats on the daily, and someone threw a bomb in his bedroom window. The society did not accept inoculations until Boylston's experiments. People thought that inoculations were counterintuitive, but when Boylston's son publicly survived due to inoculations, people began to see the light. George Washington later had his whole army inoculated, as was the British royal family. Before inoculations, the fatality rate was 16%, or 842 out of 4,1917 people. Out of the 287 people who were inoculated, only 2% died. Many people began to be inoculated, and Cotton Mather himself performed 248. The only problem was that inoculations were expensive, so if you could not afford them, then you most likely would suffer and possibly die from the infection.
Mather's ideas were initially ignored by others in the medical field. When Boylston started his experiments, some saw this as simply infecting people with smallpox when it was harmful and avoidable. Boylston was threatened for his ideas to the point where he had to hide in his own house for 2 weeks while men who wanted to hang him came and searched for him. He was forced to see patients at night, disguised from those who opposed his ideas. Boylston continued to share said ideas, but most viewed it as murder. As the town of Boston was full of chaos and smallpox had infested the majority of houses, Boylston's work was ordered to stop. By the end of the 1721 epidemic, 247 to 282 people had been inoculated by Boylston, and some by Dr. Thompson and Dr. Robbie, who operated out of Cambridge and Charleston. At the head of the anti-inoculation movement was Dr. William Douglas, who focused on the lack of trials and evidence to support inoculation actually working. He saw it as a way to create new cases and spread the disease, rather than a way to lessen the casualties. Other opposing arguments claimed that inoculation messed with God's plan and harmed the innocent. At this time, it was clear why inoculation was seen as unethical, seeing as it was dangerous and unresearched. During this time, tensions with the British were high in Boston. Political dysfunction led to the outbreak being so bad because nobody worked together. These politics took a turn in 1721 with the introduction of free press. James and Benjamin Franklin made a newspaper called the New England Courant. These men saw inoculation as a reason to launch free press in the colonies because it was a popular topic. They tended to follow the popular opinion of inoculation, which meant that they did not support it in their newspaper. This newspaper was published without the okay from royal authorities, and yet it still managed to set back Mather and Boylston's work. Benjamin Franklin, under the name Silence Dogood, wrote racy and funny stuff. This was popular and reached a wide audience. Franklin observed Boylston's experiment, and only later did he advocate for inoculation. The introduction of free press to the colonies allowed for people to spread their views on inoculation. At the time, this was not a good thing for Boylston and Mather. On the other hand, free press was also used to advocate for Boylston's experiments. Boylston was able to use the press to write a newspaper article in July of 1721 describing his experiments. Ben Franklin later used the free press to advocate for inoculation as well. This helped inoculation be used in the following epidemics to save multiple lives.